best known gun battle in American history is the gunfight at the OK Corral. It wasn't much of a gunfight, actually. The Earp brothers just pretty well shot some people down, but it's famous. 9 men, and in about 1 minute, 35 rounds were fired, 35 bullets. In 1992, police were called to a shooting in Baltimore, Maryland, where, as the officer said, he found the drug dealer with the 2 guns smoking at his feet. He was dead. He was wearing a bulletproof vest, but had finally been shot through the head. He had been ambushed by 2 men, one of whom had a fully automatic weapon. He had 2 semi-automatic weapons, and in the space of less than 20 seconds, 65 rounds were fired. The experience of homicide in the United States, then, is 65 bullets flying through the air of an American city in the middle of the afternoon. Throughout this, I will stress how social group-specific homicide is, and I will try to explain the increase in homicide since 1968, pointing out that it has not been spread evenly across the social groups of America. I want to do 2 things. First, I want to present a picture of what we think we know about homicide in the United States, focusing on the changes since 1968. And then I want to focus on the characteristics that will help us to understand the higher homicide rates and to understand the difference in homicides that have occurred since that time. I will focus on firearms and on a culture of violence. First, talking about rates of homicide. Over the past 50 years, from 1940 to 1968, there was a relatively normal homicide rate in the United States. Never went below 6 per 100,000. It never went above, or never went below 4 per 100,000. Never went above 6 per 100,000. Very stable, very predictable, very much like European rates. But in 1968, those rates started to go up, and the increase has been dramatic, and it has been steep. In 1980, it was 10 per 100,000. For 30 years, the homicide rates in the United States did not change, and then in 10 years, they more than doubled. First, take as a normal base those normal homicides. The husband killing his wife, as I say to my Swiss friends when I do this in Switzerland, the farmer in Appenzell, the Austrian farmer in Tyrol, or as you would say in Maryland, the farmer in Hagerstown, who spends 40 years nagging his wife, and after 40 years finally comes in and she's had it, and he says something to her, and she takes the frying pan and brains him. normal fights. Two friends who go into a bar, get into an argument about who the greatest baseball team in history was, and one of them winds up dead. Normal homicides. They have stable characteristics and have had for years. It's a male activity. About 85% of all of them are male, both as offender and as victim. They are poor, both relative and absolute. They tend to be urban homicides, and they involve friends or family about 70% of the time. That's in the United States and in Austria. But since 1968, there have been changes that have occurred in a superstructure, the kinds of homicides built on top of that. One of the things that has changed most dramatically has been a change in relationships between offenders and victims. There's some problems with coding, but I'm not going to go into that. Let's talk about what really shows up. In cities in the United States, about 50% of all of the homicides now involve strangers or enemies, not friends or family. So the base is still there, but these new homicides are building on top of them. That base is where we've always like kills like. You always hurt the one you love, you usually kill somebody like you. Same age, same group, same sex, same social class. So we've always been able to use victim data to also tell us about offenders. But the Baltimore data and some data that's from St. Louis, some data that's from Chicago, has both offenders and victims by case, and we've been able to see some problems coming. Among those, I'm 50 years old. I don't look it, do I? See, I can say that to a class, and the class has to agree with me because I'm giving them grades. Five years from now, if I am murdered, it will not be by somebody like me. It will not be by somebody my age or in my social class. Most likely, if I am murdered in Baltimore, it will be by a group of young men, probably minority men. So we see an increase in stranger homicides. We see an increase in felony homicides. We see an increase in robbery homicides. And as a result of all of that, all of these are the kinds of homicides that are harder to clear. So we find a decreasing homicide clearance rate. Years ago, I used to be able to say that about 80% of all homicides were cleared. Currently, anything from 40 to 60% of all homicides ever get cleared. Related to the relationships, we see a second change, which is age of the offenders. Now, despite some political claims to the contrary, there was not an increase in juvenile homicides in Baltimore, or apparently in the nation, up to about 1986. The rate of juveniles arrested nationally showed very little change up to about there. But all of that has changed now. Between 1986 and 1994, the rate of juvenile involvement in homicide increased dramatically and statistically significantly. There has been, since 1980, a dramatic increase in the 18 to 25-year-old age group. 30 years ago, all of the things I used to be able to say to classes, can't say anymore. 30 years ago, for years, the most common age, for homicide offenders was 30 to 34. In 1980, that age had dropped to 20 to 24. And in 1991 and 92 and on, by a very small number, but still small enough to make it the number one group, the largest group, the modal group for homicide offenders is 15 to 19, with the concentration in the 18 and 19-year-olds. A third change, also related to the other two, ethnic and racial rates are changing and we're losing ground. From 1950 to 1980, the difference in black and white homicide rates decreased. We closed the gap. In 1950, blacks were 10 times more likely to commit a homicide or to be involved in a homicide than whites were. By 1970, we had dropped that to 5 times more likely. In 1991, it has gone back up to 7 times more likely. And in 1990, for the first time since we've kept records, a majority of victims and offenders, not just a disproportionate number, but an absolute majority of victims and offenders of homicides are African Americans in the United States. So there are changes in factors and changes in types as homicide has increased. It has not increased across the board, so the type as well as the rate has changed since 1986. As a result, the effect of the change, the increase, is not spread evenly across the American population, but it is focused and concentrated in specific social groups, and it is devastating those groups. So what are the key factors in this homicide change? What brought it about, or what can we hopefully use to explain it? Well, let me do two, and let me start with firearms. My research in Baltimore, Decker and Rosenfield's research in St. Louis, and Block and Zimring's research in Chicago all shows the same thing.